Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this webinar with Margot Note. My name is Bradley, and I will be your moderator for this webinar titled Internal Advocacy Fundamentals for Archivists. Before we start, I would like to provide some information about our company and introduce today's presenter. Lucidea is a software developing company specialized in museum and archival collections management solutions, as well as knowledge management and library automation systems. Our brands include Sydney, Presto, Argus, Archivera, Eloquent, and Quadrastar. Now I would like to introduce today's presenter, Margot Note. Margot Note is an author, archivist, and records manager helping individuals and organizations harness their history. As a principal of Margot Note Consulting LLC, she facilitates the understanding of the importance of unique collections, suggesting ways to manage them and use them to tell stories to connect with people. She is also a popular guest author for Lucidea's Think Clearly blog and has provided us with many great webinars that are listed on our website, so please feel free to check those out after today's session. Take it away, Margot.
Thank you so much. So I'm really excited to do this webinar today because this is a topic that's really near and dear to my heart. I feel like as an archivist, I mean, maybe I'm just speaking personally, I feel like I always have to advocate for myself and sometimes kind of defend the profession and try to educate people about the importance of archives and our profession as archivists. So obviously, one part of advocacy for archives is thinking about the things that we do best. We do preservation, we do accessibility to make sure our materials are being used, and then also the management of both the collections themselves and our departments within the larger organizations in which we work. And I think we're at a unique time period where we have a lot of challenges that come from, I would call, the modern enterprise. So thinking about data volumes, we not only have, I mean, we still have paper records being created, but of course we have born digital records being generated all of the time, as well as digitized materials. So we're dealing with the physical, the digitized, the digital, and hybrid collections, and thinking about the needs of both physical and digital, and just the incredible amount of volume and information that's being generated every day by creators, by organizations. And then we're thinking more, even more about ethical and privacy issues. So making sure, I mean, I was just reading an article about privacy is the new luxury, and I think we're being more and more aware of, as we are in this digital world, there's issues regarding privacy and ethical issues regarding archival collections. And then of course, legal standards. Part of that is, laws are always changing. In some ways, it doesn't necessarily affect the archives world as much as it does more regulated industries, but it definitely, there's legal impacts that we need to be aware of. And these are always kind of the challenges that archivists face when they're managing collections. And so part of internal advocacy is really getting alignment. So I find, and I've been perfectly guilty of doing this, where I love the stuff, I love the metadata, I love the records. I want to be with those materials. And I found before I started my consulting practice, when I did have jobs where I was working with archival materials, is that I tended to isolate a bit too much because I was excited about the things, but it really is about a part of advocating internally within your organization is really thinking about alignment. So thinking about how can the archives department or repository or whatever office or unit that you're part of, how can it help with business continuity? So as leaders change positions, as people retire, as people get promoted or move on to other organizations, how are we capturing this information, especially in this new work world where there's a lot more churning of positions? How do we make sure that we're capturing information that's going to help the organization? And part of that is knowledge management. So thinking about knowledge management, the way that I think about it is archives and records management. Thinking about what are the intangible assets that the organization is creating. I have a client right now that's a charitable trust. So obviously they have a lot of monetary, tangible assets that they have, property, investments. But then I'm trying to argue that I think even more important and more untapped is the intangible assets that they have of all this knowledge that they've created by their grant making. So I'm working with them to figure out what a knowledge management program would look like to really think about that knowledge management. Another thing that has to be aligned is archival labor. And that's something that obviously is, it seems almost invisible. Like somehow these collections just get appraised and organized and, digitized. And there's not necessarily the people behind it. I know, and I appreciate that the Harry Ransom Center at University of Texas, Austin, they had, I don't know if they still do, they have a little plaque in their exhibit hall where they acknowledge archival labor, which I really appreciated because it is something that we have to advocate for, because this is labor that has to be, takes many years of practice, many years of education. It's not necessarily easily understood, but it's incredibly valuable. We can't just have any old person process a collection, or we shouldn't at least. And then the alignment has to be with organizational goals. So I think of all potential departments within an organization, I think the archives department in some ways, which a bit unfairly, has to kind of justify what it's doing. The accounting department doesn't have to do that, or maybe fundraising, but I think the archives department really has to be very clear that the work that they're doing is tied directly to organizational goals. And I think there has to be some practical intertwining of that information so that people that are decision makers can understand how the archives department is aligned to the greater organization and its goals. So I would say when thinking about internal advocacy, so again, thinking about how can you advocate for yourselves within the organization, you have to ask yourself kind of several questions as kind of as an exercise. And this is thinking about what areas should improve to achieve organizational goals. So I think it's more useful than saying, what's the most important thing the archives can do? For example, the most important thing an archives could do was perhaps process its backlog. That's very important from an archivist. Yeah, I want to have a minimized backlog. I want to make sure that everything is processed and available. But, in the larger scheme of things, when we're thinking about unlocking potential and getting aligned with the organization, what is something specifically that the archives can do that has impact on their organizational goals? So really having kind of a deep think about what that might be, and that might not necessarily be aligned with what you think is the most important thing for the archives to do. Kind of a trick question. There's also thinking about leveraging strengths. So what are the strengths, the things that the archivists do already that can be bolstered, that can be promoted? So it generates ideas to promote performance. So if your department or in your position is really good at offering research for and supporting your colleagues, like really lean into that. Like think about how can I make this process even better? So it's, if you think about that book that was really popular maybe 10 years ago, Strengths Finder, it's saying like you don't have to be a well-rounded person. It's more about thinking about what are your specific strengths and really emphasizing those, because those will set you apart from everyone else. And that's the same thing that you should do with your archives department or your position. What do you do really well that your colleagues understand, that value, and how can you make it even better? It'll put you in a much, I think, stronger position. And then in some ways, you're thinking about the performance gaps. So what are areas or services that must be developed? And it really kind of points out like these are performance gaps that if they're not changed, threaten the archives. You might find there's several performance gaps that really prioritizing like what is the most critical that would have, if we fix this performance gap, it would have the most positive impact. So again, thinking about your strengths, but then thinking about your weaknesses, the most critical weaknesses, and trying to remedy some of those performance gaps. And then another question is thinking about the program needs. So how can improvements be made to your particular program, thinking about present and future needs, looking at your resources and looking at your support. Now, in some situations, you might not be in a position where you can ask for more resources, like hiring a new person or getting a specific type of software or technology tool, for example, but at least you can be aware of what those might be, so that when there's opportunities for an ask, like a grant comes around, or there's a project that someone that's the decision maker that really wants it, you can use that kind of leverage to get what you want. I think it's always important to have kind of a wish list of both what's realistic to ask for, let's say in this budget year or next budget year, but then also thinking about the future. What do you anticipate the future needs to be? I think are equally important. I think sometimes we focus sometimes more on the short term, which I mean makes sense, and we're not necessarily thinking about the long term strength of archival departments. So there's several advocacy strategies to think about. Obviously, one is seeking support. So looking at your colleagues within the organization, seeing what you do well, seeing how you can use that network of people to help support the program, to talk about your program, and to really help win them over. I would also say integration into daily operations. Now, I think, so I talk a lot about, and previously with Lucidea, with webinars and blog posts and a book I wrote about project management. I'm a big fan of project management and projects. And I think archival projects can really help put an archives and archivists on the map. It's a way to build a resume. It's a great opportunity to build skills. But I think equally important, and I think with advocating within the organization, is integrating the archives into daily operations, so that if anyone is thinking about reducing funds or reducing staff, it's more difficult. You're kind of ingrained in the daily operations of the organization. I think that's the way that you can advocate for yourselves, through a practice, through your work, and through your just daily operations with people. And then also thinking about the long-term positive outcomes. So I think advocacy can be, sometimes when we think about internal advocacy, it's because it's a looming threat. We think that, okay, there's a new budget coming, or someone's has now been hired that are looking at, all the departments. There could be possible layoffs. There's always like these potential things that are looming. That's I think when we get thinking really about advocating. But I think we have to have a really long goal, a long vision. So really thinking about the long-term positive outcomes, and that way advocating for yourself and your department isn't something that's necessarily reactive to some threat, either real or perceived. It's part of your everyday operations, part of how you work. It's ongoing. It's not just a one-time thing. So I'm calling this the advocacy trifecta. There are three things to think about when you're advocating internally within your organization. You're thinking about goals, you're thinking about your audiences, and you're thinking about your messages. So goals are really thinking about both within your department and the larger organization, what is needed, why is it needed, and who will benefit. So putting some, and I always find it helpful, like maybe every 6 months or every quarter, or let's say you work in a university, every start of the semester or end of the semester, you have a little bit of time to do kind of like a step back, a few hours, let's say on a Friday afternoon, where you're really thinking about these things. I think, I found when I was working at a 9-to-5 job as an archivist, I would get so caught up in like the work I was doing, I didn't really carve out that time to kind of have a step back and think about these things. So really think about, what are you trying to do with the archives, and being really clear about that messaging. And maybe you're not really sure. So maybe that's a sign for you to think about, okay, we really need to nail down what are we trying to do with this program. and thinking about your audience. And this is kind of more of a psychological thing. So you're thinking about kind of within your organization, 3 types of people. Who are the decision makers? Who are the people that can make and break your program, that can say yes to funding or for staffing, that have the power to say no? I mean, there's a lot of people that have the power to say no, but equally important and more important is people that have, have the buy-in and the power to say yes, that can get that grant for you, that can say yes to whatever project that you want to do. You want to really be clear about who those people are and develop relationships with those people in a way that is authentic to you, like not, and this is really, I mean, I'm an introverted person, so I know how difficult this can be for someone that is not an extroverted person, like a big people person, but it's so important, especially for introverted people, to do this. And then thinking about who are the supporters. So of those decision makers, and maybe other people within your organization, who are the people that support your work, that understand the value of archives, that are fans, that are fanatics, that are allies, that it's good to have those relationships with, and to strengthen those relationships and to really lean on those relationships to help you if you're in any type of threatened thing that's happening where people are kind of questioning maybe the department or your budgets or your finances, etc. And then who are the opponents? And then these can be decision makers as well, but who within your organization, for whatever reason, don't understand archives, don't value archives, that actively kind of muck up the works. Those are kind of equally good to be aware of. So I can give an example, like I'm giving kind of vague, thinking about these categories in vague ways, but I can kind of think about a past position I had where the decision makers were the president and the COO. Maybe there's some other people that could maybe weigh in or not, but I mean, those were the main people. And basically the COO was running the show. And she was, luckily, she was a supporter. She understood archives. She understood what I was trying to do, and she had the connections to get some grant money for the archives. So it was really important that she had that power and could make those connections. Now, when the president left and there was a new president, then this supporter had a little less power, and it was this new president, who I would say would be an opponent, was really questioning like what was going on, trying to make cuts. There was a loss of a major donor. So it was, they didn't, I think, especially like a new president coming in, wants to see is future focus. It's not necessarily past focus. They're not interested in the past at all. They have to fix the present, and they have to have a legacy for the future. So inevitably, like, they were obviously an opponent, and it was kind of hard to build a relationship with that person because they just didn't want the relationship. I should also say too, the opponent in this scenario was also the CFO, and that was really tricky too, because he had a really tough personality. He did not want to spend any money at all. He saw the archives, I mean, from his point of view, he saw the archives as spending money, and he didn't understand the intangible value of the archives and the potential for huge grants that these archives could and did generate. So that's kind of an example of kind of a scenario where I was working in, and it was tough, but I had to really think about what that audience was and try to play the cards that I was dealt. Every organization is different. Every personalities are different. So it's really helpful, again, having a bit of a step back and really with yourself, if you're a lone ranger, or with your team, like mapping these people out. And it sometimes is like, in an office environment, you don't want to be gossipy or like to be talking about people, but I think it's sometimes really good to really clarify the perceptions that you think these people have of you. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. I mean, obviously it's an internal conversation between yourself or a small group of people, but I think it is good to figure out who the players on this chessboard are and see what plays that you can make. And then we're thinking about messaging. So why does the goal matter? What is what you're trying to do with the archives matter? What examples support the message, and how will the message be communicated? So talking about the scenario that I used as an example, I knew that part of what I was trying to do, I don't know how successful I was, but I was trying to show how much the archive saved money for the organization. I was really thinking about cost savings. So how are we efficient? How did, let's say, processing the archives collections, looking at records management, how did that save money in offsite storage? How did I support, especially the financial teams, goals? So if they had historical information that they needed, I could get it instantly because I digitized their records for them. And then also thinking about, from a program perspective, there's a lot of program directors within this organization. So I was thinking about what are kind of messaging that I can use for them. So for projects that they were working on, they sometimes needed historical documentation of what had happened in the past. So I knew that was my way in to make that connection. I also knew that the marketing department was a big ally of the archives because I was able to supply information and stories and images to them. So I was thinking about how can I kind of strengthen the message to them that I'm there to support their work, to make their work easier. And then how would I communicate that? And sometimes that's a matter of just checking in with people. I mean, this is kind of pre-pandemic, so we were all in person. So it was, chatting at someone's door, chatting over coffee. Sometimes it was like lunch meetings. Sometimes it was kind of sidebars in meetings. I think in a more virtual or remote environment, it's maybe having something on your schedule saying, okay, every month I'm going to check in with this person, or maybe there's a committee that you sit in with, or maybe there's kind of a natural cadence that's part of the work that you already do that you can just put a little note, okay, check in with this person, see what they're looking for, reconnect with that department. If you have maybe like a cold, maybe you've had a warm relationship with people or a warm contact with a department for a while and it's gotten kind of cold, how can you at least warm that up, put your name out there, volunteer some information? It's really thinking about what that messaging is and what that cadence of the messaging could be. Something that makes sense, that is natural. So I think the big book on this subject is Larry Hackman's Many Happy Returns by Society of American Archivists. It's written about maybe 10 years ago, maybe a little bit longer. And I mean, he really kind of puts it out there and he's completely right. He's saying, advocacy is essential. I know that SAA a couple of years ago was really good about talking about kind of external advocacy. So talking to your policy, policy people in your state and your local government, getting out there, talking to the community. These are all really important pieces, but I think personally, the internal advocacy, I think, is more critical at times because it's related to resources and jobs and money. And you really have to do that work, I think, internally before sometimes you're doing that external work. So Hackman is saying, influence your superiors. So think about going back to thinking about your audiences and your messaging. What can you do to help influence them for them to have a more positive view of the archives? You want to cultivate supporters. So that could be both obviously the decision makers, people with a lot of power with the organization, but also people that have influence within the organization. Sometimes there are people outside of the organization. So if you have any type of board members that are fans of the archives that you can connect to, councils, any type of groups that you work closely with that are maybe not within the confines of your organization, maybe slightly outside, those are people that you want to cultivate as well. I mean, it is sometimes scary to talk to board members. I mean, I always find it kind of frightening, but they do have influence. And I think sometimes, depending on their personalities, they're ready, to listen and to help. You want to address crisis that happen at the time. Like if there's something urgent within the organization, like a big meeting is coming up, you want to support and find information, or there's a launch of a new program that you need the images for, or whatever way that you can, that's kind of a critical moment. You want to obviously take advantage of that and show your value. You don't want to have any like crises go to waste, is basically what Hackman says. And then be risk takers. So I think this is kind of the interesting part where he says sometimes it's like you have to go above your boss or your boss's boss to talk about the archives, and that can be kind of a scary situation. It can be a bit brave to take that risk and to do something different, but I think there's nothing, if you're using it to advocate for your program, for archives and your position, I think it's well worth the risk, and you might and by being brave, I think you might get more of what you're looking for. So digitization is a way, I kind of find an easy way to win people over for internal advocacy, because non-archivists don't necessarily understand archives. They can understand to a certain degree, but it is, what we're doing is kind of a black box, and we're not very good at explaining it to others. But I think digitization is something that people can kind of understand, even if they're not necessarily tech savvy or big users of archives. So it's a way to obviously transcend physical boundaries. So you're not necessarily forced to be using the materials in a reading room. You can have things online or have more online reference. It can really make access and collaboration. It can really foster more ways to use the materials, to work with the archives. It's a way for different disciplines to work together. So especially within organizations where there's different departments, there's a way to really collaborate with digital files. And there's 24/7 access. So if someone's working on something, let's say they work a little later in the night, or they're more of an early bird, or they're working at let's say writing an annual report, they can have access to some of those materials without having to schedule a meeting or to have you look through things. It allows them to do some self-service. And again, it allows the archives to be really useful. So it's another, and they don't necessarily understand or want to understand kind of the back end of what that takes, but they do understand the value of that information at their fingertips. And so I think digitization is a way to get people aligned with the archives, but it's also obviously a big way to get grant money too. And people obviously love that. I think sometimes there's a bit of a resistance to archives. I feel whenever I talk about this, or I never wanted to talk about archives in a negative way, but I do feel that there's people that like don't understand it, and they're kind of a little hostile about archives sometimes as well, sometimes, at least what I've seen. So I think there's a way to kind of move against that by thinking about collaboration. So thinking about what departments can collaborate that you can help them with. Are there, let's say, underrepresented stories within your organization? So I find, especially like the business archives, or with kind of archives related to a specific entity, there's a lot of stories that are generated about the history of the organization, but that's kind of the kind of like the oral history of like what's happening. But there's so many more interesting stories that are found within the archives that I think archivists can help unearth and give a kind of a more nuanced understanding of the organization. And I think whenever there's resistance, we always have to use open dialogue, really talking to users, talking to colleagues, and a little bit of education. So education that's not overwhelming, but really thinking about, how can I help you? How can I make your work easier? Because in many ways, archives are there to support, and archives within an organization are usually there to support the organization. Maybe there's some outside support they're offering as well, but obviously you're helping your colleagues. Another way that archives can be used to do internal advocacy is thinking about organizational responsibilities. So obviously archives are evidence. They're evidence of things that the organization has done, of transactions, of events, of people, places, and things. There's a lot of, it can be related to legal matters, compliance, accountability, transparency. So I think that's when you can lean on how the archives support the organization in that way. I think people understand it. So if you can align more closely, let's say with your legal department, with your compliance department, sometimes with your financial department, like if there's any department like that, I think that's a good allegiance and a way that you can talk about organizational responsibility. Obviously, archives are also one obvious, supporter is any type of kind of marketing or social media publications. Like that's also a kind of a natural. I think in some ways I personally think about that connection more, the marketing perspective, but I think there's also a huge amount of connection that you could have between legal and compliance or whatever that looks like within your organization. So obviously there's challenges with internal advocacy and archives in general. We have limited funding. There's never enough money to do what we want to do. We're, given, dust and we have to spin gold. So that's always a challenge. So I think in some ways we're thinking about how can the archives help support the organization with cost savings, with efficiency, but obviously you don't want to get into kind of a scarcity mindset where it's like we're asked to do more and more, less and less, because the bottom is always going to drop out. So really thinking about, there's limited funding, but how can we work with that? How can we maximize the funding that we do have? It's thinking about advocacy strategies. So how can we, maybe in the past we advocated in a certain way, we talked about our value, like I find myself always talking about informational value and evidentiary value, but like a lot of people don't really care about that or really understand it. So how can we better target what we're saying with our advocacy strategies? So, thinking about, again, that organizational alignment with organizational goals. So how can the archives specifically help the organization do that, and that? Enhancing resources. So again, thinking about what you can do with the resources that you already have to maximize what you have. And then there's kind of changing policies. So sometimes there's changing policies within the organization. There's new mandates, things are happening differently. Maybe there's someone that has more power, a new decision maker that wants to do things completely differently. So it's really the challenge is trying to align yourself with an organization that's always in a state of flow. There's nothing ever static. So a big part of that is understanding decision makers. So thinking about when we talked about audience, when we talked about decision makers, the people that can say yes to what we want to think about their motivations, their preferences, how can we get increased buy-in, and especially when this is related to resource allocation issues. And this is very personality driven. It's like almost you're kind of doing a psychological makeup of who these decision makers are and seeing what excites them, what they're passionate about, what they hate. So, okay, don't approach them in this way, approach them in that way. And once you understand kind of, especially their motivations and preferences, you can use that to leverage to help you get what you want and to advocate for yourselves. So obviously you have to know their priorities. So understand what is important to them and then identify their priorities and concerns. So what are what is something that keeps them up at night? The board is breathing down their neck about XYZ, or a major initiative is happening in 3 months and they don't know if it's going to be done in time. Like think about like what causes them stress, like what kind of freaks them out, and then help them get what they want, and then knowing what they like. So I had a decision maker that loved she was like a rainmaker. She loved getting those grants, asking, and she was kind of fearless in doing those big asks. So I knew, okay, she's going to go in a meeting with this organization to get funding for all this. Like, how can I prepare her that she can go in? And obviously, like a lot of times she was asking for more kind of program related, like big funds. But then I was able to give her kind of some talking points about the archives. And a lot of times, she would kind of assess in these meetings, how much do you think I can make? Or like, how can I get this grant money? Or how can we negotiate this? And it was good to have the kind of archives material in the back pocket as another thing to be funded. I mean, this is unusual, but there are people that work this way. And within your organization, you're going to have those types of personalities that you just have to figure out their likes and dislikes and help support them to get what you want. Using appropriate language is really important. And by that, I mean matching their interests and needs, but also avoiding archival jargon. I've been completely guilty of this, where I've been talking about metadata and metadata crosswalks, and people, they did not get what I was talking about. And why would they? I mean, they are high-powered people. They don't care about the details. I should have just said captions or descriptions. And I found myself like, I love the details. I think archivists in general, we love the nitty gritty. We love the granular. We love order from chaos. But we have to think, when we're talking to people that are kind of more big picture, we have to talk in the language that they understand. And it is difficult. Like, we have to translate our work to them because they don't have to understand. They don't have to understand what we're saying. We have to make sure that we're saying stuff that they understand. They don't have the time or the energy or the need to understand us, but we need them to understand us. And it's our responsibility to do that education and communication. So to supporting operations, so again, thinking, obviously I love projects, but thinking about how can the archives be aligned with the operations within the organization, and thinking about what that day-to-day looks like. How can we be so enmeshed in the organization that we are obviously someone at that table, that big decisions are being made? Like, how can we help support what's going on? How can we know that if someone is looking, like has a research question or is brainstorming about something, that they know, okay, call this person in the archives department. So we have to really think about and make a concerted effort to support operations. And that doesn't necessarily come easily. I think that comes over time of developing that relationship. You might have people that are naturally that type of person. Like, I know that if I went into an organization, I wasn't an archivist, and there was some type of library or archives, I mean, I'd be thinking about how can they support me. I would be the one, because I'm comfortable in that environment and doing research. But there's a lot of people that I think would love to know the stuff that you do and have no awareness of how you can help them within your organization. So stay informed. And again, this is something that, in the day-to-day work that you're doing, it's hard to keep track of all your professional development. I mean, obviously you're participating in this webinar, so that is kudos to you. But stay current on trends, technologies, initiatives, and priorities. I know what's helpful for me, because I know personally, if I don't have it on my schedule, I just won't do it. So every Friday afternoon, I have a little reminder that I have a whole bunch of stuff bookmarked. I prefer websites other than like email, like listservs or anything like that. So I know every Friday afternoon I have my routine. I set a timer and I open up all the bookmarks and I see, what educational opportunities are out there, what are webinars that are happening, events, all the organizations I'm part of, or museums and archives and libraries and professional development organizations. Just kind of keeping on top of that and seeing if I'm interested and scheduling those things into my calendar. I have to, that's something that I just won't do on my own. I won't think about, I'd rather do, scroll through Instagram or something like that if I had like a moment or two. But I know that if that's on my schedule, I know Fridays at 4 p.m., that's what I'm doing. And I would say, try to find a system that you can do that without thinking. So you're always kind of keeping on top of things. And what I love about Lucidea, I should say, and why I've partnered with them, is that they provided a lot of free information. And that's what's important to me. There's obviously organizations that have, paid webinars or paid courses that you can take. But what I love about Lucidea is that they're able to provide a ton of information for free. And that's what's exciting for me and makes me want to do these webinars. So evidence-based practice. So kind of in your back pocket, you want to have kind of like a brag book to think about what are examples that the archives have benefited the organization. Who's been your happy customers? How have you helped with this specific project or this particular goal or operation? So again, like really capturing this information. And again, this might be something that you do as part, like figuring out the cadence. So every month, every quarter, every semester that you're thinking about what are the success stories. And sometimes it's just a matter of having a running list of kind of this brag book of how you've helped and what's the evidence that you're providing. So you've helped this number of people with inquiries, or you've digitized this amount of materials or processed X amount of linear feet, or helped with this annual report or this quarterly meeting. So really thinking about what's the evidence that you're successful and valuable to the organization. And obviously, archives, you want to make sure that we're aligned with the mission and values of the organization and showcasing the impact of the archive. So there might be so when you're talking about evidence-based practice, that might be kind of fact-based evidence, kind of practical ways you've helped, but then there's also kind of the more theoretical, like the missions and the values. How have you made your department align with the mission and values of the organization? That tends to be more theoretical, but that's, I think, equally valuable. Teamwork and collaboration is important because archives don't work in a vacuum. We want to provide examples of how you've helped different departments within the organization and to highlight the collective effort in achieving goals. So think about the people within an organization. Who are you helping the most? So marketing, legal, I don't know, HR, specific programs, and thinking about, strengthening those alliances that you already have, and then thinking about how can you help other people, or other departments. I was talking to a client a couple months ago that worked at, it was a university archives, and they were saying, funny enough, the history department, and we were really doing stakeholder engagement assessment, and we're thinking about all different departments, and their history and literature department, that was kind of a cold, whatever that relationship, there might have been, I think, a past or relationship with maybe a past position that was in the archive. So you would think that history and the literature department would be more aligned with the archives. It was interesting that the biology department was a huge user, and more of the STEM people were more aligned with the archives. You would think more of the humanities, but it was very interesting that was part of personalities involved. So faculty members, like they were doing specific research. They love the archives. They love the support of the archives, past successes that they had. And so it was interesting to think about, what are other departments that you can align with? We were even thinking about like the maintenance staff. They were someone that were good allies, but really thinking about the maintenance crew on this university campus. They were the ones that would say, hey, we're cleaning out this room and there's an amazing amount of records or artifacts or an old piano or an old uniform or something, and they would call the archives. So like really thinking about holistically, and that example, every department on campus, we went through all the different departments and saying like, and really thinking about what are the relationships, what are teamwork, and how can we move everything from good to great as far as those relationships went. You want to obviously have connections with the objectives. So you're not only aligning your archives department with the organizational goals and decision makers, but you're also thinking, I think, on a deeper level about the connections between the collections and the objectives. So I think there's two things that are happening. Both we're kind of strengthening the archives department and advocating for ourselves, our positions, but then we're also advocating for our collections too. So thinking about how the materials within the archives play a role in meeting goals. And embracing advocacy, I think this is something that, it doesn't, I mean, I'm speaking personally here, but for me, this has never been before consulting, it was very hard for me to speak up and advocate for my program and for myself. And so I understand if there's any hesitancy or just thinking this is a little bit too much, but I would advise everyone to be brave, to think about what within your organization, within that very unique environment, all different personalities, all different positions, they're as unique as every archival collection. So thinking about what are the opportunities for discovery, for learning, for connection with people, with colleagues, with decision makers. And I think that's going to really have an effect, maybe not immediately, but I think in the long term with resource allocation. So when you're thinking about staffing and budgeting and all the different resources that you need, I think that's going to sway the needle, I think, in the long term. And also thinking about kind of technology shifts. So I think now more than ever, as we are more digital, there's in some ways, it's easier to connect with these audiences, with these colleagues. There is some distance, especially if a lot of things are being remotely, but there are so many tools at our disposal that can really help us embrace advocacy for our archives and our collection.
Thank you, Margot, for the wonderful presentation. And we're also very excited to announce that we will soon be publishing Margot's next title for Lucidea Press, Preserve, Promote, Persevere, The Archivist's Guide to Internal Advocacy, which is the next in her series of thought-provoking and timely publications for archival professionals. And if you'd like to learn more about our archival collections management system called Archivera, please feel free to visit our website or reach out to us at sales@lucidea.com, and we would be happy to have a chat with you. And finally, if you have any more questions on any of our software or our company, our contact details are listed on the screen. And please stay tuned for more webinars and content related to this series. On behalf of the Lucidea team, I thank you all for attending today, and until next time, thanks.